First, my thanks to the government of Malaysia, and particularly to EPU for the opportunity to come here and to share with you some of our perspectives on the issue of innovation and growth. I'm a strong believer that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, but I'm gonna use a PowerPoint presentation simply because I want to share with you some of the images and slides that put the situation of different countries, and particularly East Asian countries, in perspective. So I'm going to speak for 40 minutes or so, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity later then to engage in a dialogue about some of these issues. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about the Growth Commission. I don't know how familiar you are with the studies of the Growth Commission, but I think it's an important point of reference in our understanding of what are the inputs to the process of growth. And then I'm going to shift exactly to the issue of innovation, something that, as you are all familiar with, Malaysia is putting lots of emphasis in the context of the NEM. But is something that, interestingly enough, was not at the forefront of the analysis of the Growth Commission. And I'm going to reflect a little bit why was that so and why we think that to have a focus on innovation is very important, particularly for middle-income economies, but for all economies if we want to have sustainable economic growth. Then I'm going to talk very briefly about the Great Recession, another name for the current financial crisis, that we hope we are out of it, but it's the old story. We don't know if the light at the end of the tunnel is really the light of the end of the tunnel or a train coming in the wrong direction. So we have to be careful here, and although in East Asia the implications have been relatively more moderate than in OECD countries, still there are implications for the world economy. Now, I will be putting this analysis particularly in terms of the perspective of catching up experiences, like, for instance, what has happened in the context of Brazil, India, China, vis-a-vis Korea. And this, as Dr. Noria pointed out, is based on this book that you can download from the OECD website, which is called Innovation and Growth, Chasing a Moving Frontier. This is a part of a series of events that the World Bank, my department, and OECD, Pier Carlo Paduan, the chief economist of OECD, have been organizing on this topic. Actually, in March, we will have a follow-up conference, which is on the topic of innovation and inclusive growth, particularly looking at the issues of how innovation can have a positive impact on income distribution and how countries have, let's say, administer these types of impacts. So that's more or less the idea and the focus of the presentation. So why are we particularly interested in the East Asian experience? Because East Asia is exactly the region where we have countries that in one generation have successfully caught up with OECD economies, particularly Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, China, and the Republic of Korea. These are countries that in 40 years came from developing country levels of income, and nowadays, and Korea is a particularly interesting experience, not only because it has caught up with OECD levels of income, but it's now a leader in terms of research and development. And you know, economists disagree on many, many things. Actually, I always like to mention a story of a conference many years ago in the 1960s in the United States, where there was a debate between John Robinson, a famous British economist, post-Keynesian, more to the left, and Gustav Reines, a well-known academician from Yale, more neoclassical, and they were disagreeing on everything. Till somebody from the audience, this was in the 1960s, asked, but could you give us at least the example of one country that have had a model of development that has made a huge difference for its society in one generation? And both of them answered Korea. And the audience was relieved because finally they were agreeing on something, till they realized that John Robinson was talking about North Korea and Gustav Reines about South Korea. This debate nowadays is over. Nobody would recommend the North Korean model as a model of development. But the South Korean model is one that, particularly for the debate that we are having here today, is a relevant one. Now, in the context of the Growth Commission, what they did, they tried to identify 13 countries. Well, they identified 13 countries, among them Malaysia, that were able to sustain very high levels of growth, above 7% on average per year, for a period of at least 25 years. And the 13 countries are the ones listed in this slide. You can see that several of them have by now reached high income status. The dates in parentheses are basically the period of the experience of high sustained growth. You can obviously also notice that in East Asia, often this had a point of inflection in 1997 with the East Asian crisis, financial crisis. But in many of these countries, you had also other types of problems. Brazil, for instance, the country where I come from, had a very strong process of development and growth up to around 1980, and then the impact of the so-called debt crisis. There was a long period of a very limited, actually, in some cases, we used to talk about this period for Latin America as the lost decade. So these were experiences that the Growth Commission analyzed, and it came up with the following observations that are, let's say, the conventional wisdom about growth. First, that macroeconomic stability is fundamental. Because if you have a high inflation, if you have a situation of significant disequilibrium, be it in your external accounts, be it in your fiscal accounts, you're gonna have probably significant noise in the economic signals in the economy, and this noise typically is going to dominate whatever positive results you may have from investing in innovation, for instance, and having productivity enhancement. So this is more or less obvious. So there is no country that has had significant long-term sustained growth without having a modicum of macroeconomic stability. Another aspect, market orientation. This by no means suggests laissez-faire, much to the contrary. But it requires that the government, when acting as a regulator, when intervening in the economy, respects the overall signals of a market economy and address eventual market failures. Once again, the most successful economies were able, for instance, to benefit from integration with the international economy and somehow to use the market signals for orienting its own investments. And this comes together with the issue of openness, the point that I just made, the comparison between North Korea and South Korea. Then another aspect, it's the aspect of future orientation. And what does this mean? Typically, economies that have grown at a sustained high growth rates have had a very significant rate of investment and savings. And also, in this context, we can argue that attention to issues of innovation are part of what we could characterize as future orientation. Last but not least, strong leadership and governance, a very transparent process of allocating resource. This also helps. Leadership is very important because vision makes a huge difference. But we have to keep in mind that vision without implementation is hallucination. So what you have to have is not only a vision, but also the capacity to implement that vision and in continuous dialogue with your society to be able to show that you are going in the right direction. Now, as I mentioned, if you read the Growth Commission report, you are not going to find a specific detailed analysis of the role of innovation. Why is that so? Well, innovation is, for most economists, and we're going to hear more about this in a moment, a kind of black box that we have a hard time to explain in detail what is behind the process of innovation. It's difficult to measure. But there is one thing that most people would agree, that it's fundamental in terms of explaining enhanced productivity. And as Paul Krugman likes to say, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run is almost everything. So if you don't have innovation, your ability to sustain high levels of productivity growth are going to be challenged.